Hello and welcome to My Security TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage and I'm the Executive Editor with My Security Media. And welcome to our panel review, a industry panel review on looking at ransomware today. So this week the government has released an action plan and we're going to be joined by Ian Yip, the CEO with Avertro, Sarah Sloan, Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy for Australia and New Zealand with Palo, Alto Networks. And welcoming back, we welcome back Ian as well, and also welcoming back Elliot Dellys, the founder with Phronesis Security. He's a cybersecurity advisor. So we're going to bring on the panel very, very shortly. And this covers off, we did a panel review on the Australian Cybersecurity Centre's threat report very recently. So it's great to be getting these panels together. And I think it'll be something that we continue to do into the future as the government responds to cybersecurity and the threat landscape. And without further ado, I'm going to bring on our panel, and in no particular order, Elliot Dellys, Sarah Sloan, and Ian Yip. Thank you very much. Quick audio check.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Okay, it's all working. Very good. Now, slide looks okay up here, but I'm going to get rid of this slide eventually. But I'll keep it up there so people can get a sense of who you are, and I might even put you in order. There you go. Ian, we might start with you. You're top there, CEO of Avertro, and we have had you on before, so it's great to have you back. But maybe just briefly introduce yourselves in terms of your role, and even if you want to go one step further and how much you've been monitoring this particular action plan. There has been some discussion coming through, but yeah, Ian, just how things are going with you at Avertro.
Yeah, so I'm founder and CEO of Avertro. We're a local cybersecurity software startup. You may have heard of us. So yeah, we do monitor what goes on in the government fairly regularly, because obviously we have to keep up with what's going on, and we speak a lot to the government organizations that we help, and also the organizations that are also impacted as a result of government regulation and legislation.
Yeah, and you're definitely keeping your commentary up, you know, as things come through, which I think is a good thing, even from us, and getting your sense as you observe things happening. So hence, it's great to reach out to you. And Sarah, Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy, you're probably the most important person in the room here, I suppose, in terms of this is government policy being put into action. Your role with Palo Alto Networks? We have an audio issue.
I've got it.
Thank you.
I think I would have left by now. So many Zoom calls, but I haven't. So Sarah Sloan, heading up Government Affairs and Public Policy for Australia and New Zealand, as you said. So Palo Alto Networks, one of the largest cybersecurity companies in the world. We operate in over 150 countries worldwide with about 87,000 customers across the globe. And my role is I'm the primary interface with government in Australia and New Zealand on legislative and policy matters. So actively monitoring what the Australian government is doing in the policy space, and trying to kind of engage and work collaboratively with government to shape some of these policies.
Right, and we understand you're the pen and the brains behind the submissions that the companies like Palo Alto make to government as they engage with industry.
Well, drawing on the collective expertise across the company, I can't say I'm solo the brains behind these things, but really, yeah, definitely working with the company to make our submissions, yes.
Very good. And Elliot, good to have you back. And this is a good segue from the last panel where we covered off on the Australian Cybersecurity Threat Report. So I think there's some good continuity here that you provide. Yeah, just your role. And have I pronounced it right? It was the first time I wrote it. Is Phronesis?
Phronesis. I have a habit of picking weird words for things. Yeah, so I'm the founder and chief realist of Phronesis Security. So we're a cybersecurity consultancy. Therefore, we work with organizations where ransomware is often front of mind, work with critical infrastructure providers as well. So I've been paying a lot of attention to the upcoming changes to the SOCI Act. Previously, I led the strategic consulting practice for managed service provider across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So I've also seen, I suppose, both sides of the time zone in terms of how Australia is often sort of insulated from ransomware campaigns by virtue of where we sit on the globe. But I think we are recognizing that that's beginning to change, and so it's nice to see some steps in the right direction. I've also spent some time working with law enforcement around the investigation of cybercrime, so I also have some understanding, I suppose, of the legislative and technical challenges that currently exist for law enforcement in prosecuting these sorts of crimes. And I also started my career as an operations manager in defence. And so the other component of this, and I think Sarah will have seen a lot of this as well, is the lag between the threat environment and regulatory change. And that's a real challenge, because being agile and responsive to changes as a threat environment and balancing that against getting locked into a point in time response is a real, it's a real fine line to work with policy. So yeah, glad to be back, Chris.
Very good. And again, just to highlight, I was kind of thinking aloud, is we also ran a session last week with John Blaxland and Australian National University and William Stoltz, looking at the potential need for a Minister for Intelligence on that across the national intelligence community. And obviously the ASD and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, Home Affairs is all in that. So this is all culminating together interestingly, and how they are grappling with ransomware. Now, I have one holding slide that we can talk to, at least to introduce the audience to what this is about. And if you haven't picked it up, it is available obviously at Department of Home Affairs, but otherwise you can go to the My Security Marketplace. It's there as a resource, and I'll just blow this up. It's not an extensive document. They've kept it pretty light on. As I mentioned before, it's a bit like a skeleton. There's not a lot of meat on the bones in the actual plan itself, but it's broken up to prepare and prevent, respond and recover, and disrupt and deter. And it does seem to have a bit of a lean towards the disruption and deterrence. Welcome to the panel to open it up, but I think the standout to me is a task force from the Australian Federal Police. So they're actually going to start to go after them, and that'll be I would imagine, a multi-agency approach. Any initial standouts from any of you on this? And maybe even let's start with, was it needed? And then two, Elliot's kind of touched on it. It's coming a little bit late. With what's your initial thoughts on it initially? And we might start with Sarah, if you don't mind, in terms of how this fits with the submission that you make, that Palo Alto made, and is there anything missing or any good bits?
Yeah, so I think just stepping back, this obviously sits in the broader framework of the 2020 cybersecurity strategy, which was released last year. And I think this strategy is really welcome, I think, by most industry, supporting Australian government's, combating the threat of ransomware, which we've really seen, I guess, move from a cybercrime nuisance to this national economic security risk. So just going to your point about whether it's needed, I think the answer is yes. It's very welcome that government is taking such proactive measures to address this rising threat. We kind of recognize that the strategy is a multi-pronged approach to tackling ransomware, and I think that's really important, that national strategies focus not just on response and recover, that they also focus on things like prepare and prevent and disrupt and detect. And I think that's why this is so strong in some of the tools, I guess, that are available to government, such as legislation and law enforcement responses to combating this ransomware threat. So really welcome the strategy, and very much looking forward to working with government on delivering and supporting the delivery of the strategy.
What was it specifically mentioned in the cybersecurity strategy, a ransomware action plan?
No, not to my knowledge.
Yeah.
It wasn't, but I think it fits in under the strategy. Of course, there are a range of measures that government has implemented, which all kind of go to tackling cybercrime more broadly. So I think it sits and complements those activities.
Yeah, I think legislative frameworks, I think they might have been referring to back then. So this is obviously the first one. Ian, the task force, I liked Operation AUKUS. They have to be careful with the AUKUS strategic partnership, the Australian, UK and US, which is AUKUS, and this is AUKUS. They're pretty much, they sound the same. Multi-agency task force out of the AFP. Do you think this is a good thing? How much impact will this have on the industry or ransomware sector, I suppose, if you look at the black hats, what their initial thoughts might be and whether it's going to have much of an impact? Because Australia, as Elliot points out, hasn't had a huge sort of impact on ransomware in comparison to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, so if I've gone on record a few times to kind of question why we have the government has an obsession in terms of messaging with ransomware. Like, I get it's a front and center threat and it's good for messaging. I do wish sometimes we would take a slightly more holistic view of the world. However, having said that, I do think it's a good thing because at least it brings eyeballs and we're having this conversation about cybersecurity and trying to do something. So in that respect, it's better than nothing. Specifically around your question, I mean, the first thing that stuck out to me was a lot of the perpetrators of ransomware don't sit in Australia. So while this does give the federal police a little bit more teeth and power to go after people, the next question I asked was, well, what about how does DFAT play into this? What does our international relations have to say about this? Are they involved? What does that look like? It doesn't spell it out, because if we're going after ransomware criminals in Australia, I don't know how often that's going to be the case where we're actually going after a local cyber criminal versus one in a different part of the world. So
if it's a Russian ransomware gang, we won't name any, but there's plenty of them, and not just the Russians, but the Russian are synonymous with it. What are we specifically going to do? What is AFP going to do in terms of that task force? I suppose it then elevates it to a Five Eyes principle approach as well. Elliot, we'll just focus on the task force approach at the moment. Your initial thoughts on how Operation AUKUS will go, because it's a response to the surging ransomware threat. And ASD now, they've got capability now to target and attack back. I don't know if that's been actioned yet, but I know they've been discussing it. So this comes up to that ASD level now, where they can potentially counter-attack. Is that how you would read that?
I won't speculate on ASD's capabilities to counterattack, but I suppose what I would comment on is the provision of an extra 100 personnel as part of Operation AUKUS, I think is quite significant.
Right.
I think the AFP, like law enforcement agencies around the world, has had its own challenges around getting traditional policing techniques to align with the tradecraft that you see with cyber criminals in general. I share Adrian's pain at only ever talking about ransomware. I think in part Australia has dodged the bullets so far, and one of the things that's nice to see with this is that we're not waiting until we have our own colonial pipeline hack to actually put into force some sort of regulatory change. I think the challenge will be finding the right people to provide that skill set. Getting 100 extra people is fantastic, but actually identifying the skills and the qualifications and the investigative techniques you need to put into place to make sure that you can actually have some enforcement mechanism behind the changes they're trying to make will be the challenge. I think anyone that works in the industry recognizes that there's a skills shortage in Australia in general. So how the AFP is actually going to attract the right talent and how they're going to be able to coordinate that function with overseas partners and intelligence agencies and industry. I think the logistics is probably going to be the hard part. Getting the money and getting the resources aligned, I think is probably just the thin end of the wedge.
Interesting, you raised the numbers, and that comes at full circle back to the Australian cybersecurity strategy and that spend over the next decade, and how was it like 500 people into ASD over that period of time. And Ian, just park that thought, because the pressure that puts back on industry and the skill base for industry, let alone the government demanding more. And there's a lot on skills. And referring back to the interview with Michelle Price, we covered off on cybersecurity skills and the uplift required there, is well worth the listen. But I will say, coming back to Sarah, and there was a media release straight after this that came out from Labor, and Tim Watts, the Shadow Minister for Cybersecurity, on their side. I like the way they now call it's the Morrison-Joyce government, as if it's a dig at the government. But they introduced in June, they introduced a ransomware payments bill 2021. So they're claiming that this is a sort of a Labor-led strategy. How much politics is in this, do you think, now, as we come up to an election? And maybe, I know you might have a fine line here, but we're coming up to an election, and the play on national security is going to become an election issue, and then cybersecurity is obviously a big thing. The numbers speak for themselves in terms of that threat, in terms of that rising. We saw it with the Australian Cybersecurity Threat Report as well. But how political could this potentially get on cybersecurity, and is this part of that approach, do you think? I mean, how much real change will an action plan like this make, or do you see it potentially being political?
I think it will make significant change. It does set a pretty good vision and at least communicates what the government's kind of priorities are, I guess, in tackling ransomware. There's a lot of talking here about modernising the legislative frameworks around the criminal code, the Crimes Act, the Proceeds of Crimes, all to make, I guess, the job of law enforcement tackling this threat, investigating it, and getting access to the illegal profits much easier, which I think is a significant step change. And granted, it takes time for legislation to make its way through Parliament, for it to be appropriately drafted, and to get that kind of buy-in across government, and that's reasonable. So I think there will be significant change that flows from this. We've also seen measures around international cooperation, and touching on the points of my colleagues on this panel, that's super important in the context of ransomware, which is obviously global in nature, and you've got victims, criminals in multiple jurisdictions, leveraging global infrastructure. So those two elements, I think, will put Australia in good stead. And as I said before, they're important tools in a multi-pronged approach, and they're the tools that government has available to it to kind of pull, if you will. And it's really important that government is taking measures to do so.
Yeah, I think maybe where I'm coming from is for the audience and for all of us just to be cognizant of how politicians will handle this. And it does seem like we had Erica Betts on recently too. So just monitor as we come into an election. We don't have a minister for cybersecurity, and we used to. Just get a sense of how cybersecurity is there in the national dialogue at a political level, and then obviously at an operational level. The AFP, the ACSC are like, they'll be hands up saying, okay, well, we don't necessarily have all the powers that we have, and we need to adapt to a very sort of global landscape. But again, I would come back to, we've had computer crime legislation for many, many years. So, how much of this is actually new to segregate and sort of that it's complicating the legislative framework, because I would have understood we've already had all of this legislation there. And maybe coming back to how this might relate to the critical infrastructure bill and the other pieces of legislation coming through. Any comments on the legislative frameworks coming through and potentially the impact on the industry? Is this good from an industry perspective? Does it help conversations with clients that they have obligations under new legislation?
I think it gives industry a bigger stick to whack people with, which is a good and bad thing. I think it's good for boards and all the decision makers having to care about stuff. That said, I think it's probably the level of frustration with the security leaders amongst the industry, where they're very well aware of this. None of this is new to them. So I think from their standpoint, it's probably a little annoying. And back to the point you were making around politics, I think there is definitely a level of optics around this, because the opposition is more or less owned the narrative, I think, nationally for ransomware as a topic. Mr. Tim Watts said a lot about it. I think the Biden administration overnight talked about 30 countries around the table where they were discussing the impact of ransomware on the world, and it is very, very topical. So our actual government probably needed to make sure they were part of the conversation, as you said, leading to the election. But if you go back to the industry, I think the last thing, I say this sometimes when we speak to industry people, the last thing we need is more frameworks and more legislation in a lot of the minds of people trying to combat the threats we have at hand.
Yeah.
So the two-sided coin of this is good for optics and people thinking about it and top-down pressure, but it's just one more complication that CISOs have to now deal with in terms of regulation. And I think they've just got to find the right balance, and that's the key, right? The right balance with additional things like this, putting pressure on them.
Well, one thing I find with this one, it's a bit of a standalone document. I'm just bringing it up again, and we've mentioned skills, we've mentioned sort of international frameworks as well, and our 5I partners. This is not a new thing either. We've referred back to 2020 cybersecurity strategy. We've got the critical infrastructure bill coming through. There's a few other things can rattle off as well. And this isn't linked to anything. It's a bit of a discussion document just to say, hey, this is what we've got. This is our idea here. And what I would like to see is a visual framework at the back, which says, okay, here's a new action plan for ransomware, and this fits into this framework here. And when you look at this document, you should also be looking at these other documents, and it doesn't do that. It kind of stands alone there. Elliot, in terms of there was one area I wanted to touch on, was the raising awareness and advice for business, critical infrastructure, large business. And I think we might introduce where the critical infrastructure bill is coming into this as well, because one thing we talked about, Colonial Pipeline, right? That's one thing they don't want. There's a case study in the plan of a hospital being taken offline. I'll raise Cyber Awareness Week with AusCyber. They have on their Monday, on the 25th of October, they're running a hypothetical which involves a hospital. So, worth having a look at that one. But it's already happened. And now there's been some industry pushback this week on the critical infrastructure bill and how that's being reported. So just your thoughts on the raising awareness in this plan for critical infrastructure, large businesses, and even small and medium enterprises, and then how it directly or indirectly relates to the critical infrastructure bill and the operational side, or the implementation of this is probably where I'm heading to, and how that legislation will be applied, as Ian mentioned, the big stick. Yeah, just your thoughts around how the two will come together, because I think this is where the rubber hits the road, really, from this plan.
Yeah, I think Ian's comment of, oh no, not another framework is probably pretty accurate. I couldn't help but think when I heard it was an action plan, not a strategy or a framework, of a sort of a Yes Minister style skit where people are sitting around going, we haven't actually come up with any actions yet, so what should we call this thing? It's fine, we'll call it an action plan. Look, I mean,
Utopia, it's a Utopia episode for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I mean, there's a necessity for something, right? As it's called out, there's an attack every 11 seconds, and ransomware damages are projected to hit $20 billion by 2021, right? It's a huge issue. There needs to be some action. And fundamentally, I think at the moment, it's a matter of when, not if, a critical infrastructure provider in Australia gets hit with a significant attack. So it's good that we're not waiting for that to happen. That being said, the action plan itself is somewhat of a pastiche of other things going on. We've got the SOCI Act amendment, we've got the surveillance legislation amendment, we've got the ACSC's Act Now, Stay Secure campaign, we've got the cyber and critical technology engagement strategy, we've got the cybersecurity strategy, we've got the international cyber and critical technology engagement strategy, all coming out within the last year. So I think there is a really significant risk of information overload for industry. And I think probably what's needed is a bit of coordination and communication around, exactly as you said, here's a one-pager that describes how these fit together. This is your industry. These are the mandatory requirements that apply to you. I'm a big proponent of just doing basics well. I think it's true in everything from sport to cybersecurity. Generally, the people who are the best are the people that get the basics done really, really well. And then you can start to put more sophisticated technologies, processes, and things on top of that. Yep. So my personal view would be something like just really trying to provide resources and drive home the need to establish something like an Essential 8 reporting framework, saying, okay, if you're a critical infrastructure provider, how do you benchmark against this? Obviously, SOCI amendments are a good step towards that. My concern would be, are we creating confusing, overlapping, contradictory requirements? If we're going to have two different frameworks that mandate some sort of mandatory reporting, which one takes precedence? Do I need to report based on my SOCI amendment reporting requirements, or do I need to report based on whatever legislative instrument is going to be used to enforce the Ransomware Action Plan? So fundamentally, I think this is a step in the right direction. I think it's good that the Australian government's on the front foot and being proactive about this rather than waiting for a major incident to occur. But we are getting very close to the point where there is a risk of muddying the water to the point where people who want to do the right thing simply don't know what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Sarah?
Yeah, I think I was just going to add there, I think that's a really important point, that the reporting is all aligned, because at the moment we've obviously got this discussion about reporting ransomware incidents. As you say, we've got the SOCI Act and the reporting obligations under that act, but we've also got the Privacy Act, which has the Notifiable Data Breaches Bill, those reporting requirements for companies with a turnover of 3 million or more annually. So it would be really great, I think, if those reporting requirements were all streamlined so that organizations are reporting to one entity, that it's one form, and that the timeframes and things like that are all aligned. just to make it that bit easier for all the companies that have to do the reporting.
Yep. And I mean, I think, again, I mentioned you're the most important person in the room here, being, well, legal background and policy approach. When you looked at this, because I've just looked at it again with a bit of a fresh eye on the discussion of where does this all fit in, it's kind of a high-level government document, really, at the end of the day, that says the government's doing something. So I come back to the political tick here that I think it's just the government's doing something on ransomware, and I think just ticks that box, because it's then referring to a lot of the operational stuff that's going on, and it's because, as Elliot just rattled off, and I tried to as well. You did a much better job, Elliot. There's a lot going on that's intertwined here and not quite displayed in this particular report. Is that how it works, that you observe, Sarah, that the government will release these kind of high-level sort of we're doing something documents, but really at the operational level, on the implementation side, it doesn't really make any difference to what they're already doing? They're all, as you mentioned, they're already working on these other other aspects to the cybersecurity problem. This is a high-level document for the. Is that how you would see this? Is that how we should see this as industry?
No, I think it sets out, like I said before, I kind of think it sets out a strategic vision for where they're going and what they're going to be working on. And I think, we have seen since the release of the 2020 cybersecurity strategy a fair flurry of activity. It's definitely kept me gainfully employed in terms of the amount of consultations and papers and activities that government has been doing. And I think, that kind of enthusiasm and energy in our sector actually is a good thing. Granted, we need to work collaboratively with each other to try and figure out what, approaches work best for industry and for government. But, it is a good thing that they're doing something and they're articulating where they're going. And I think what this document will do is will kick off activities within government. It kind of sets the, the North Star, or however you want to phrase it. And then all the government agencies are going to rally behind that with, the diplomatic arm, the more law enforcement arm. And I guess it does highlight to external stakeholders that, the government is taking ransomware seriously, and it's now asking all its respective agencies to try and think about ransomware in their particular portfolios or departments, and what their activities should be to help, the broader Australian economy address this threat.
Okay, and I do come back to our interview with Senator Eric Abetz in terms of his call for a cybersecurity forum at a national level. I think it was forum. I don't know if that's the right term. It's lost on me. But in terms of that national discussion, and it might, because it comes back to the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and that they've been looking at this as well. And I again go back to our John Blaxland interview last week on the national intelligence community as to the structure here. One area I wanted to cover off, and plenty of time, is the critical infrastructure bill and that reporting of 12 hours versus 72 hours. And this fits into this aspect of the mandatory ransomware reporting. So if you are critical infrastructure getting hit with a ransomware attack, under critical infrastructure bill, you've potentially got 12 hours to respond. I'll just open it up. Is 12 hours enough time when the international standard is generally 72 hours? And we've had an open letter from industry this week to Minister Karen Andrews to say this is no good and we want it reviewed. Just a general observations on that particular aspect, the 12 to 72 hours, and whether that is reasonable for industry to be reporting and responding, dealing with the regulator, because that's diverting potential resources at the crux. Elliot, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, sure. I mirror what Ian said before. I think most organizations don't know what's happening within the first 12 hours. Certainly the instance that I've helped manage, and usually the first 24 hours is madly trying to find phone numbers and segment networks and isolate devices. And usually the last thing you're thinking about is telling a government regulator what's going on. That being said, I think it's probably a matter of what exactly is the government expecting. If it's simply a notification of, hey, we're dealing with something, we're not quite sure what it is yet, would love some help, I think that seems fairly reasonable. If it's, you need to provide a comprehensive report that's going to significantly detract from your incident response capabilities, then ultimately it's not fit for purpose. So I think the time frame, 12 hours is very ambitious. It probably won't happen. I think my bigger concern would be what exactly are you asking people to report and how you're going to report it. Looking at the implementation of GDPR, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learnt there. And I think fundamentally, my personal opinion, one of the sort of downfalls of GDPR was that the harm assessment principle gave organizations the freedom to sort of creatively interpret how bad an incident was. I would like to believe that every organization will be open and honest about the impact of a breach. But that being said, trying to make a decision like that within the first 12 hours as to the severity of an incident is a bit of a tall ask, and I certainly wouldn't want it to ultimately be counterproductive and encourage organizations to obfuscate what's going on rather than be open and honest about it.
Yeah, I think that there is a potential risk to pull out of that. I think the Australian Cybersecurity Centre has been quite engaging to sort of join with them on their notification schemes, and they're quite regular in terms of those notifications too. Worryingly, actually, the amount of high alerts and the like that do come out. Ian, your thoughts on this particular aspect? And the other thing is with critical infrastructure, there's 11 sectors that are brought into that, very broad. And just your observations, you've been in the industry for a while, of where the capability and maturity those 11 sectors are to kind of start to respond to this.
Yeah, the 11 sectors are very varied in terms of their capability, like the opposite ends of the spectrum. Some, even the best ones probably realistically won't be able to solve the problem within 12 hours. And then some of them just won't even know something's happening for about 2 weeks at best, right?
Right, yeah, that's another
thing. That to deal with. I do think, look, I think the best the government can hope from this is that they get a heads up within 12 hours. And I think a lot of organizations will just have to update their incident response plans, at least the ones who have them, to give the government a heads up. Because I think some of this stems from, and the ACSC has been very public about this, a very large Australian organization refusing to cooperate with them in the midst of a ransomware attack, right? So this at least gives them some teeth to say, at the very least, tell us what's going on, because it could be a matter of national security, and then we can help you.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's realistic for them to resolve it within 12 hours, but it should be realistic for them to be notified within 12 hours and then potentially triage and help.
But I think under that act, they do have the capability to move in and take over, though, don't they?
They do. So
that's a game changer, though. I think that's the key aspect. Is, as Elliot pointed out, it might be as simple as an email or a phone call to say, we're dealing with something. If it's on a bigger scale, that could open up the door for them to go, actually, we're sending our team over and we're going to be taking over this incident. And that's where critical infrastructure, which is privately operated and owned, and often with multinationals in here as well, like you're not necessarily dealing with a sovereign owner, that's a legal framework that they might not be used to and certainly don't want. And it puts us on the other side of where we might have to go at sort of communist nations to say, oh, you guys control everything, but really at the same time, is this not the same legislative framework that we now have? Sarah, the legal frameworks here on how this is actually going to work in your background, is this aligned to your submission, Palo Alto Networks? Was there anything that you maybe touched on in this particular aspect of how the Critical Infrastructure Act might be instigated and those powers of enforcement and reporting? How do you see this kind of working, or any comments there?
Yeah, so I'll just touch on the incident kind of reporting requirements first, and then I might come back to that. I think some really good points raised here about incident reporting timeframes and some of the challenges there. The committee, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, actually did recommend from memory that organisations could give a verbal notification within 12 hours with a written notification to follow. But I do agree the devil's in the detail about, what is the expectation for that verbal notification and how much detail organisations are expected to provide, noting that it can be very tricky within 12 hours to get across exactly what has happened and mitigate it. And then organisations, of course, have the added complexity of notifying customers, internal processes. You've got legal, you've got communications teams that all need to be brought on So that can really make
let's just focus on that one. Even just that notification in 12 hours, from a legal perspective, is there liability potentially there? You know, when do you know about it? You're going to have to put your directors on notice. No trading. Don't start trading or trade a share, 12 hours and 5 minutes. There's a lot of implications on notification, isn't there? It's not a simple process where people in government who might not completely understand that, but from a legal perspective, notification is a big deal.
Yeah, and I think that's why, the international best practice, as you said before, is 72 hours, does allow, and I think they've also used within reasonable timeframes or something along those lines in terms of wording there to give companies a greater flexibility to just determine exactly what's happened. And of course, we really don't want to end up in a situation where we're providing data that's not actionable, that doesn't help support decision making, or that's just frankly incorrect. We want to make sure that we're providing the right data and we're really supporting the responses from government and from other industry.
So I think one thing we will try to clarify is what the expectations of a notification is and the potential implications, because the other one is if you're notifying a regulator, then that potentially puts liability on you to notify all your stakeholders in the same vein. That would be, I would argue that would be reasonable. If you're a stakeholder, a supplier, customer, and there's a breach, well, you're telling the regulator, you should be telling the market. If you're an ASX listed company, you're going to have to tell the market, I would assume. That's about right, Sarah. You don't have to give me legal advice, but that's where that's kind of why it's so critical here, isn't it? If you're notifying one person or a government, you're going to have to notify potentially everybody, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's potentially, yes, it may be the case. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of every company and all the obligations that they need to meet if they're ASX listed, but yeah, it raises a number of complexities, I guess, that are triggered from suffering an incident and the notification process.
And I suppose nothing heard under the Critical Infrastructure Bill, because this is a national security approach, whether that notification is not legally binding, if it's protected by legal professional privilege or under national security legislation or whatever that is. So yeah, there's a lot of implications there, and hence why I think that letter yesterday, I think we've put it up on the Australian Cybersecurity magazine, or we have referred to it in terms of that. But that was from the AIIA, the Australian Information Industry Association, the Technology Council, and the International Technology Association, or whatever. There was 3 big ones. So out of Washington as well. So well worth the. I think that's about it from this particular session. Maybe closing comments from the panel on ransomware plan and what maybe the government might have next. I think the Critical Infrastructure Bill and how the PJCIS is managing and monitoring all this is something to be looking out for. And we've kind of mentioned the election coming up and seeing where cybersecurity sits. Just some closing comments. Maybe closing comments on the action plan, and then your expectations as we close out 2021. Maybe start with Elliot down there.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think my closing comments would be about mandatory reporting more broadly. I think something that the government really needs to take seriously is the balance between carrot and stick. And what I mean is, if you're demanding that organizations are going to be, pausing their incident response procedures to notify you of what's going on, and it's radio silence back, and that becomes the dominant story from every person that goes through this process, there's a serious credibility risk for the government there. And I know from my consultation that this is something that I've heard before, that organizations, they do their mandatory reporting, they expect to get some sort of feedback or support back, and they don't hear anything. And they feel a little bit like, well, what was the point of that? I thought that this was going to be a bit of give and take. I provided everything I possibly could, and I haven't heard anything back. I'm by no means saying that happens all the time, but this is a risk I think that the government needs to think about, is if you're going to ask organizations to do this, what are you going to be able to provide in return? And you touched on this, Chris, when you're talking about, the ability to sort of take over an investigation. I actually think a lot of organizations would probably welcome that, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, all yours, go.
In reality, I think really what the expectation would be is, here's some playbooks about dealing with ransomware. I mean, the ACSE does a great job with its publications already, but I think there's probably some room for just adding a bit more technical detail to the resources that are made available. CISA in the US, by example, provides a really comprehensive ransomware playbook that goes right into the weeds around doing containment and eradication. That sort of level of detail would be really useful, I think, and I think that would soften the blow a little bit of asking organizations to report. And then the only final comment I'd also make is, if you're going to say it's mandatory, then how are you going to detect non-compliance, and then what are going to be the penalties correspondingly? And I think once that picture becomes a bit clearer, we'll have a bit more of an understanding of how exactly the industry is going to react to those changes.
Yeah, I always come down. Communication is key, and it's an ongoing dialogue. We did do a panel session with Department of Home Affairs and Clarity as well. That might be worth having a look at. But yeah, it's available on demand. But again, you got a sense that there is offence to them. But Home Affairs and the way the Australian Cybersecurity Centre work together, they're in different departments, right? ASD and Home Affairs are two different beasts, so they're trying to manage it together. And yeah, final comments on you, and I'll imagine we'll just continue to get your commentary on your observations in industry, but yeah, just how you found all of this and your expectations for the rest of the year.
I think Elliot's point around the carrot and stick is probably a good focal point. The government's really good at sticks. They don't ever help. So figure out how, if you're going to mandate something, then maybe give the industry a little bit of help. Here's a bunch of playbooks. Here's a bunch of free stuff. And so you're in a better position to work with us and give back. I echo what Elliot's saying. The frustration of industry is they never give back in information. They never give back in anything to help. So some of those mechanisms to give some carrots instead of just stick all the time will be great. I don't foresee them actually doing it, but I wish they would.
And there is no money here for industry within that strategy and the like. Very little money for industry in the critical infrastructure bill and the uplift across those 11 sectors. No money for industry there.
No.
There's a bit coming out for training, some grants for skill uplift, but again, not a lot.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, I still think this goes back into our 2016 strategy, the cybersecurity strategy. There's still, even there was underspend then.
Yeah.
And they've even, to make it sound like they're spending a lot of money now, they've had to say 10 years. Like, we're spending 1.67 billion over years. It's like, okay, that's still not quite enough here. And if you look at defence budgets, a $90 million submarine deal is small fry for them, seemingly. So
yeah. So I think the most tangible part of this for industry is probably one more thing to help prioritize and build a business case that cybersecurity is important when a CISO is trying to say, this is why I need a budget for something. We've got another thing to deal with.
Yep.
Government's going to mandate it. That's the tangible.
Well, maybe just from you, on your startup, you've got Avertro there. It's a bit like a scorecard system, I understand, in terms of being able to communicate your cybersecurity posture.
Yeah.
Do you feed these sort of updates, frameworks, legislative changes into your platform?
I mean, we do. So this is why we have to keep across all
this is why it's so frustrating for you, right?
Yeah, because it does make it really complicated for our customers and the industry to deal with. So it's just one more thing for them to deal with. So we know that ransomware is part of the narrative, which means we get asked by a lot of the customers in the industry going, well, can you help us deal with this? How do I? Because there's no guidance. So a lot of times, industry, everybody around this panel, our customers, CISOs, have to invent ways to deal with the sticks that keep getting thrown at us.
Yeah.
So,
and you haven't dealt with, and a lot of, I suppose, a lot of clients' perspective, and I might come to Sarah on this one as well, of how do customers prepare for something yet been hit with, but you're saying it's going to come, and here's a whole bunch of legislation you're going to have to respond to. So there's a real balance there between, hang on, are we going to be just focusing on controls and what we can, our resources that we can actually implement, or do we have to divert all of that attention to this big thing over here that might not be impacting us yet, and we don't know when it's going to happen, but we're being told it is going to happen.
Yep.
So Sarah, how do you think, what would be your advice, or what is generally Palo Alto's advice to clients on the preparation versus the response? Because it feels like the balance is being put over to the response side. You've got to be prepared to respond versus how much preparation you should be doing on prevention.
Yeah, well,
do you think it's a bit confusing there?
Well, no, I think it's equally important, and I think the plan does talk about preparation, response, and detection. Like, it's got the multi-pronged kind of approach, and they do in the action plan for memory talk about developing materials and touching on the points raised here. You know, that is a really important pillar. I think that, you know, industry does need more guidance. They need frameworks about what security measures they can put in place that can, you know, help stop these ransomware attacks from occurring, and what's the role of automation in this. You know, how can they best prepare and prevent these attacks from happening, not just focusing on the response. So I think they're both equally important, but we just need a little bit more help, I think, from industry side, as you say, particularly for smaller businesses or those who might not have the relevant expertise or, you know, resources to be able to come to companies, you know, for the guidance and support. What is out there from government that can help fill that gap.
And any closing comments from you on the plan itself and where you see things moving for the rest of the year, or what maybe even to look out for from your scope in your role? You must have a whiteboard there with a bunch of stuff listed. What's at the top?
It's actually here. I just wiped it clean.
There you go. Good.
Yeah, look, I think the ransomware strategy flags that they're updating the national plan to combat cybercrime. So I'll be keenly watching that one from afar. I think that holistic view at tackling cybercrime is, you know, just as important as ever, as we look at, you know, what the ACSC threat report saying that Australians are reporting cybercrime every 8 minutes, and it costs our economy 29 billion per year. So getting that coordination across government on tackling cybercrime, across law enforcement, I think is very important. So I'm really looking forward to updating that plan. And seeing what the role is for industry in that, you know, and also the role of industry in this ransomware action plan. You know, we've got really good access to data and threat visibility, and we can really work collaboratively with government to help combat this threat. So there'd be my two kind of final observations.
Nice. Look, my view is from an industry perspective, I've always sort of advised companies to look at worst case scenario and then work back. So start with maybe a hypothetical within the business and say, okay, we've been hit with ransomware. What are we actually going to do? If you're dealing with a board, maybe ask the board how much you're prepared to pay and then work back from that as well. We'll highlight the ESET ransomware session that we did do with Tony Anscombe. Well worth having a look on why you wouldn't want to pay as well. The other one is, I think, watch out for cybersecurity as a political level on how this discussion goes. We've now got Senator Christina Keneally as that Shadow Minister for Home Affairs. I think we're going to hear a lot more from her, and it'll be interesting to see the battle between Labor and Liberal on cybersecurity, particularly with Tim Watts as Shadow Minister, but there's no one there on the other side for the Liberals. So I think that's one to look out for as well. So look, that's it from us. I think we've covered off on as much as we possibly can. Let me just bring up my slides just to finish, but I know who you all are, but I want to get your titles correctly as well. 1 second. There we go. I'll bring that up. So we were joined by Ian Yip, CEO with Avertro, Sarah Sloan, the Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy, ANZ Palo Alto Networks, and Elliot Dellys, founder of Phronesis. Was that right? Security? Did I get it right?
Phronesis.
Phronesis, of course. What is Phronesis, by the way?
Phronesis is a concept from ancient Greek philosophy of the value of practical action and wisdom. So it's the idea that just because you know what you need to do isn't enough. You need to have a good practical approach to implementing it.
Beautiful. I went to a public school, so we didn't do Greek mythology, so I always missed those ones. Look, thank you so much to the panel. Very well worthwhile, and we'll definitely put this out as a cybersecurity weekly podcast. Thank God it's Friday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
Great.
Thanks for
See you
having me.
later. I'll put you
Take care.
backstage.